broadcasting your inclusion journey online, 18th to the 26th of November. You're listening to RIBA Radio.
You are listening to RIBA Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects, with me, Marsha Ramroop. I'm the Director of Inclusion here. We are bringing you how many? 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion into everything you do. And it's all rooted in the foundational behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence. We're talking women, we're talking caring responsibilities, we're talking race, we're talking CQ knowledge. Welcome to day 3 of RIBA Radio. We're bringing you 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion into everything you do. We've 8 down, we're 20 to go. It's all rooted in the behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence. Last week, I gave you a bit of an overview of CQ, unconscious bias, the RIBA Inclusion Charter, what we've done up till now in architecture around inclusion. We also examined the first CQ capability, CQ Drive. How much do you actually want to work with those people who are different from you, and what motivations can you work on, especially when it's tough? We covered all of that last week. Well, coming up today, it's our first of 2 days talking CQ knowledge. What do you know? What are you thinking about? What do you need to know? We're looking at different lived experiences of the underrepresented in architecture. So we're talking women and race today, with a stellar, absolutely stellar lineup for you to listen to and learn from. The Fawcett Society, Clare Nash, and then architects Melody Lung from Zaha Hadid and Farshid Misavi, alongside Roma Agrowal, the award-winning engineer. And we have the amazing author and journalist and broadcaster Angela Saini talking about race, and she'll be alongside architects Lanray Balade and Ming Cheng. As always, it's a programme not to be missed. After today's
Shock Stats.
From the Women in Architecture survey recently, more than a third of those surveyed disagreed the logistics of balancing work and home life have become easier. Some of the themes that emerged from the narrative around that survey suggested that this balancing act was having a detrimental impact on mental well-being, and strikingly, this is causing more than 1 in 10 to think about leaving the profession. But on the flip side, in the same survey, more than 70% felt that online access meant they can study and or design effectively online, even though this came with some other home life challenges. So plenty for us to dig in and explore today. If you are just asking someone for your morning cup of tea, make sure they don't do what my girls did this weekend, and that's hand over a cup with the letter T written on a tissue inside the mug. No, don't laugh. It wasn't funny. I really needed that tea. And that's not the worst they say to me either, apart from attacking my hairline, which they tend to do on a regular basis. My 14-year-old, she simply doesn't like hugs these days. And I was approaching her for one, and she grabbed a pen and she joked, "If you come anywhere near me, I'll stab you in the nose with this pen." To which my younger daughter said, "You have a lot of surface area to work on there." Oh, how we laughed. On the upside, they clearly get their sense of humour from their father, because I still have mine. Haha, lols. This hour, we have a series of interviews about key issues affecting women, not just children with their devastating shade throwing, and not just in architecture, but clearly there are lots of factors affecting women's experience in the profession. And I'm absolutely delighted that Zaimal Azad, the Senior Campaigns Officer at the Fawcett Society, can join us to discuss equal pay and the gender pay gap. Morning, Zaimal. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. Can you just explain the purpose of the Fawcett Society for a bit of context?
Morning. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, absolutely. So the Fawcett Society is the UK's leading gender equality charity, and we campaign to create a society where women in all their diversity can be free and equal to achieve their potential. So we've been going a very long time. Millicent Fawcett was one of the suffragists who started we started the organization, and we've been campaigning ever since to achieve gender equality in both at work, in politics, and in life in general.
Thank you. And so we're going to be talking about this idea of pay and equality around pay. It's really important, I think, for you to describe the difference between equal pay and the gender pay gap for clarity. Could you do that?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question to start on as well, because it can be quite confusing. So equal pay, equal pay is about having the same pay for equal work. So equal pay for equal work is the basis that our Equal Pay Act exists on. And it's about if you're doing work of equivalent value or the same work. So if a man and a woman are doing the same work, they should be paid the same. It's a very obvious kind of sentiment, but pay discrimination still exists in spite of having been illegal for about 50 years. The gender pay gap, on the other hand, is about average pay. So it's about the difference between the average pay of women and the average pay of men as a group. And so pay discrimination is a contributory factor to the gender pay gap, but there are many other things that contribute to there being a pay gap between men and women.
Now, in architecture, there is the profession is overwhelmingly led by men. And what we've discovered with some of the statistics is that although women are entering architectural education at the same rates as men, they're dropping off at various different stages to the point where we probably have about sort of 20 to 30% women in the profession. And so what kind of impact does that have when looking at something like equal pay or the gender pay gap, or both?
I think that's one of the key causes of the gender pay gap sometimes is the fact that women have more interruptions in their career. Women, you were talking as we were starting about that balance, that juggling act that women have to do. And the reality is that still women tend to do most of that juggling, most of that care work, whether it's looking after children or looking after elderly parents or looking after, society in general, people around us. And that is one of the factors that then contributes to the gender pay gap, because when women leave the workforce and then try to enter it later, they end up on lower pay. It also means that women aren't represented as well in senior positions. So when it comes to promotion or when it comes to, being in those really high paid positions, women lose out because of having dropped out, or because of those interruptions, or because of working part-time due to caring responsibilities. So it has a very direct impact on women's financial equality. The other thing that also contributes to is the pension gap, because there is a significant pension gap between men and women, and that's because as women go through life and lose out at every stage, by the time they get to retirement, it's all caught up, and it adds up to a very significant pensions gap.
So you mentioned there as well, when women tend to come back after maternity leave, are they on lower pay?
So they can sometimes end up on lower pay. It's not, and again, this is where we have a lot of laws to protect women from maternity discrimination and from pay discrimination, but a lot of the times it ends up being about culture or about the assumptions that people make, or when it comes to promotion and a woman comes back from maternity leave, there are sometimes assumptions that she might not be looking for a promotion, or that she might not she might want to focus on the family.
Sorry. Continue. Sorry, Zaimal.
And just some of those factors can then lead to that being taken into account when promotion decisions are being made. And that's why it's so important that there's transparency in promotion, and it's very clear to the whole organization how promotion decisions are made, what the process is, what that decision is based on, because while you should be on your pay before maternity, it does mean that you might not get those pay rises, or might not get those bonuses, or those promotions that then lead to higher pay.
You mentioned that word transparency. How much of a problem is the fact that there isn't transparency when determining if equal pay is an issue in an organisation?
such a big issue, because so we've got legislation to say that women should get paid the same as a man doing the same job. But if you don't know what your male colleagues are getting paid, how do you even know that you've got an equal pay claim? So one of the things that we at Fawcett have been campaigning on is the right to know, the right for women to know what their colleagues are getting paid, so that they can know if they are being paid fairly. Currently, women have to go to tribunal just to find out. And one of the things that allies can do, male allies, but also in terms of, I think when you think about the ethnicity pay gap, is to share that information, because that can make such a big difference in support of a claim, or just to know whether you are getting the same amount of money as your colleagues doing the same job.
It's a big deal, though, isn't it, culturally, to just reveal how much you're getting paid? What would need to change for people to feel okay about their pay being published, so we can have that kind of transparency, do you think?
I think we need to get more comfortable talking about money and pay, isn't it? I think in this country, culturally, that's a really big, it's almost a taboo, isn't it? You don't talk about your pay, you don't talk about what you're earning or what you're spending. And I think getting to a level of comfort where you can say, actually, there's nothing wrong with that. And this is how we get to a situation where we are fairly paid, and it's part of those, I think that it needs to be part of those conversations that you can have at work, but actually, I think also outside of work, because, that's how culture changes. The culture outside of work influences culture at work.
So what do we need architectural practices, and not just architectural practices, of course, but, other organisations to do so that we can create that transparency and start to address these issues?
Yeah. So lots of different things. I think, especially in terms of tackling when you're talking about tackling the gender pay gap, it's about transparency at every level. And so starting right from recruitment. So one of the things we've been campaigning for this equal pay day is we've been asking employers to stop asking for salary history, so that you're starting those negotiations on salary at an equal footing. So that's one of the things you can do. But that transparency is also about advertising. So firms can be advertising salary bands, being very clear and transparent on what the job you're advertising is paid and what those salary bands are. So starting from that level to then being clear on, what are the salary bands in the organization, who's paid within which band. And you don't have to necessarily say that this is how each person is paid, but being clear on what those levels within the organization are and what the associated pay with them is. And then like I said before about promotion processes as well, how is hiring happening, how is promotion happening, what are the factors that are considered when promotions are made, so that you both know what other people are being promoted on, but also what you need to do to be promoted. And that takes away some of those assumptions and prejudice that can make their way into those processes, even if they're not done consciously. They can sometimes play a part in it, and that transparency is so key in tackling that.
And what sort of measures can we use to track whether we're being successful in implementing those actions?
I think knowing your gender pay gap to start off with. So, currently in this country, very large organizations are required to report on their gender pay gap if you're an organization of more than 250 people. But there is nothing stopping smaller organizations to track the pay gap. So to look at what, men and women in the organization are getting paid, but also looking at the ethnicity pay gap. Again, that's not mandatory, but there's nothing stopping organizations from looking at that. And then creating action plans, based on those pay gaps with clear, measurable targets, and having an action plan that you then, reviewing every year and reporting on, that can make a really big difference. And I think the size of the organization doesn't necessarily have to matter in that. Even smaller organizations can do that. And within that, because each organization will be different, and it's only by exploring what your gender pay gap is and why that exists for your organization, you can start to, find solutions to that.
And finally, just looking at the reporting and the culture around reporting itself, how robust is that? And what would the Fawcett Society like to see done differently there?
Yeah, so gender pay gap, the gender pay gap reporting, and it was introduced, I think, in 2017. It has definitely made a difference, and we've seen pay gaps drop for organizations who have been reporting, but it can be better. So we've recently released a report with the Global Institute for Women's Leadership that looks at gender pay gap reporting for developed economies, and we found that the UK actually lags far behind other developed economies. So what we have been calling for is to reduce the threshold for reporting from 250 employees to 100, so that more organizations are reporting and we've got a better picture of what's happening. We would also like to see a requirement for action plans on gender pay gap. So right now, big organizations are required to report, but they're not required to say what they're going to do about those reports. Those responsible employees will have an action plan, but there's nothing to say that they have to. We would also like to see mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting, because it's really important we have that intersectional data. And we know, for example, when we're talking about the gender pay gap, that for most groups of women of color, the gender pay gap tends to be higher. So mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting is also something that we are calling for.
Thank you, Zaimal Azad, the Senior Campaigns Officer at the Fawcett Society. Coming up later, we have an excellent panel of women in the built environment. Roma Agrowal, Melody Leung and Farshid Musavi. You may know Roma from her writing, and she's the award-winning engineer. Melody is Associate Director at Zaha Hadid, and Farshid Musavi OBE, who of course has her own highly acclaimed practice. It's going to be very interesting. Very interesting, because they all have very different opinions and experiences as women in the sector. If you missed any of our output so far, including last Thursday and Friday, you can catch up on RIBA's YouTube channel, where there's a RIBA radio playlist of all the content subtitled. And we're really grateful for all the useful feedback we've had on that content, and we're working on improving that and the accessibility of it as we speak. Any and all feedback is always welcome at inclusion@riba.org, and you can contact us using the hashtag RIBA Radio for any comments and questions if you have them for our guests. If I can, I will mention them on air. Now, this hour we have a series of interviews about key issues affecting women, not just in architecture, but clearly they're factors that women experience in the profession. And I'm really pleased that Dr. Annabel Sowemimo, a sexual and reproductive health doctor and founder of Decolonising Contraception, can join us to discuss reproductive health. And there's no doubt that women and those with female reproductive organs, they have a whole host of realities that impact on working life, of which very little is taken into account. As part of the menopause work that I've been leading recently, I've made it quite clear that if the patriarchy who designed our current working environments had to manage the direct impact of having women's bodies too, our working lives would have been designed very differently. And so this isn't really about accommodations or concessions, Annabel, is it? It's really a point about human rights.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me this morning and including me in your programming. Yes, exactly. I think our whole working experiences have really been designed centering men and those with male bodies in mind, really. So we really, part of this is that we don't have research about how people navigate working spaces and how to make this better, and that's definitely a gap. But it starts really at school age, to be honest, and then it works its way through right into our working lives. It's the little things, so building workplaces where there are too few toilets that are not accessible for everybody, don't have bins in them for sanitary products or menstrual products rather. So yeah, there's a lot a lot that's missing, and I think we're only really starting to understand the tip of the iceberg.
When you think about what's missing, what are the kind of things that people need to be thinking about in the workplace?
So first and foremost, it's about making a work environment that enables people to be make their jobs as easy for them as possible, and make people as comfortable as possible. So I mentioned toilets, and that seems like a basic requirement, really, that people should be able to go to the toilet in comfort. And so when we don't have toilets that are nearby, so there are a lot of conditions that people just don't really factor in. So a lot of people, as they get older, have bladder dysfunction, particularly after giving birth, need to go to toilet more frequently, may have menstrual disorders, which mean that they have very heavy blood flow, like fibroids, for example. In one of my clinics, a woman that had fibroids was having very heavy menstrual bleeding and was working at a supermarket, was unable to get herself, she was a cashier, and she couldn't take breaks. The toilets were far away, and on a few occasions she's flooded whilst working the cashier, and she found that very embarrassing. You know, a lot of her colleagues were not particularly understanding, and it's these little things that I don't think are fully accounted for. It's also colleagues not fully understanding how some of these conditions affect people's day-to-day lives. So sometimes people would rather work from home, or they have to have multiple hospital appointments leading up to surgeries and things like that. And in a way where people would be more understanding, if somebody, for example, broke their leg, people often put these conditions down to things like, you know, oh, the old kind of historical things like it's hysteria, oh, it's just a period, oh, it can't be that bad. So people find themselves lying to their employer. When I write sick notes, I often have to be quite vague in what I write. People say, can you just say, oh, I had a gynae problem? Whereas other people could specify, and then their employers could make more accommodations for them.
So what do we need from employers then to allow this conversation to be had openly?
So there is a lot of work to be done around education and stigma. Obviously, I have the benefit of being medically trained, and also being academic and looking at all of these things. But, you know, even before I entered into medical school, I was really, really ignorant about just gynecology and things that are associated with down below in the various ways it can affect people and their mental health. I really had never spoken about topics such as miscarriage, or stillbirth or abortion. None of those things were things that I had really spoken about before I got to medical school. So there's a lot of education to be done around people understanding what those conditions are, and also even how something like pregnancy loss affects, you know, both partners in a couple. Often it's the person that's lost the pregnancy that somebody might be more sympathetic towards, but nobody really talks about the partner. So it's really doing us all a disservice. So I think education and destigmatizing some of these areas are really, really key. And we see in really basic acts that we're not taught to question. For example, a lot of people that have periods will say that from a very young age, they're almost taught to hide their menstrual pads or their tampons when they're going to the toilet. Why is that?
Yeah, I was just thinking that about how you just keep your sanitary products in your locker or whatever, and you kind of slip it up your sleeve as you walk into that's a generic, like every woman that I can see is nodding their head. Why do we do that? Why do we do that?
It's social conditioning, isn't it? We've been really told that this is a really shameful thing. It's really disgusting. We're not supposed to. We get embarrassed even if people know that we're bleeding, and it just carries right the way through. when actually it is something that's incredibly normal. By keeping all of this aspect of our lives in the deepy, murky shadows, when people have real issues in that area, and speaking very honestly, I've had very painful periods my whole life. It's almost like you can't articulate that. You know, I remember sitting one of my GCSEs, you know, and being in excruciating pain, and that was never obviously that wasn't taken into account, and I managed to do okay, but lots of people won't. And it's the same for our working lives, and I think we need to make more room for those conversations. It's long overdue.
And it's not just menstruation, though. I mean, you talked about baby loss, miscarriage, IVF. These impact women in the workplace in a way that we don't really talk about.
Yeah, there's a whole host of issues, and I know you've been doing lots of work around the menopause. I'm also a menopause specialist, and I think menopause is quite rightly now having a little bit more of a moment to shine. There's been more programs about it, and I think it's really, really important, and something that is often mentioned. Obviously, one of the key features of menopause a lot of people get is hot flushes. Something else a lot of people don't realise is brain fog. Now, something as basic as the temperature in the office is really key to people being able to work productively and engage with their work and being comfortable. And often people have mentioned in clinic, people just turning the temperature up and they're sweltering, they really are comfortable, but they don't feel like they can say anything. And why is that? So there's a whole host of issues, and they're all interrelated. It's all got to do, at the end of the day, with an element of sexism in medicine. And that's one of the reasons that we know we have less research in sexual reproductive health, to be honest. It's about the demographics that it affects. Often it is poorer women that tend to have the worst sexual reproductive health. And we don't get as much money and funding to understand some of these areas, including menopause, compared to other areas of healthcare.
So what do we want to happen in the workplace? What would utopia look like for you?
I mean, I feel like there are lots of things that have been reformed due to COVID, and I think hopefully some of these changes can stay in place. I think flexible working is key. When people have chronic illness or have an acute event or have disability, being able to work from home or adapt their working environment to somewhere other than an office is really quite key. So I think employers are understanding that they need to be more flexible to retain staff. So I think that's one really, really important thing. I also think that we're starting to understand more about obviously getting employees' experiences to how we adapt the working environment appropriately. But something that has been long not kind of overlooked is, you know, how people navigate the workspace. So, you know, where your toilets are, as I mentioned, where your bins are, where your temperature controller, who have access to that. Because in some workspaces, for example, there's a main, you know, board that covers all the temperature controllers, and not every employee can change that. So just these little things about giving people more autonomy over their workspace, and there's being some kind of feedback mechanism to say, actually, having that there really doesn't work for me, but actually it doesn't really bother anybody else. Can we change it? That's really beneficial. I also think there's something to be said about people being a bit more well-versed in having conversations with people that, you know, have very different life experiences to them. So, for example, you know, we're really, for some people, they don't see questions like, when are you having children, as really intrusive. But if somebody's struggling with infertility, then that can really, you know, mentally affect somebody. And actually, why are you asking that question? You know, there are lots of other questions if you want to strike up a conversation and rapport with somebody that you can ask. I also think there is an element of, you know, more and more we work in diverse working environments. a background like mine, I'm of Nigerian descent, being married and having children is something that's really, really prioritized. And if people don't have that, then it can be incredibly stigmatizing, and people don't want to discuss those things necessarily in the workplace. So I think that we have to build a bit more understanding of the different experiences in this area. And I think it's been overlooked for too long, to be honest.
Dr. Annabel Sowemimo, a sexual and reproductive health doctor and founder of Decolonising Contraception. And we'll be spending an hour specifically speaking about planning for the menopause at work as part of CQ strategy on Wednesday. We've invited 7 special guests from the world of architecture, design, arts and culture to present a pre-recorded music hour each day between 5 and 6 p.m. called My Soundtrack. And our guest presenters will share personal stories, unique insights, and that's reflected in their choice of top tunes coming from all areas of the musical spectrum. And today it's Paola Ferraro. Now, Paola is a Portuguese architect based in London. She currently works at Veritech, and she delivers projects across the city with a particular focus on residential schemes. And having studied painting prior to architecture, she enjoys all the creative arts, and she's an active member of Architecture LGBT+, promoting equality and diversity in the workplace. So you're absolutely gonna love her tunes selection later on. If you missed Friday's discussion about discomfort and white shame with Robin Schlenger, the anti-racist consultant, with architect Jim Rooney and Open City CEO Phineas Harper, it was a real treat of honesty, openness, pragmatism, which we could all learn from. And I highly recommend you seek it out. It's on RIBA's YouTube channel, the RIBA radio playlist, and we're going to be repeating all content in sequence here on this listen link when we come off air on Friday. A podcast version will be available as soon as we can manage it in the coming weeks. Now, Clare Nash is an architect and founding director of Clare Nash Architecture, what's been described as a radical all-female practice specialising in rural energy-efficient design. 10 years ago, Clare was struggling with a common problem, how to be an architect and still have a life, which in itself is a problematic sentence, but we'll dig into that. And she's also since had a child and has caring responsibilities that have kicked in too. She's written a book to help others with these competing priorities called Design Your Life, and she joins me in the studio now. Clare, tell me a bit about your story.
Hello, thank you for having me. So I set up 10 years ago. I was made redundant, so I was kind of forced into it earlier than I perhaps would have wanted to, but that turned out to be a really good thing. So I was very busy once I got the thing going, and I needed to take on staff. So I thought, okay, I'll employ a student where I was teaching at Oxford Brookes. But how was I going to do that? Because I really dislike commuting, and I wouldn't expect a student to have a car. So I thought, seeing as I'm there anyway once a week, why not just tag on an office meeting instead of having a full office where we have to work together all the time? So that's how the office meeting was born. And we've been running a remote team for the past 7 years. So we were well ahead of COVID. And it's quite funny because a lot of architects said to me, God, how do you do it? It's just mad running it like that. And then post-COVID, they've all gone, okay, I kind of get it now.
Yeah, so tell me that idea behind the practice. It's flexible, it's online working. Tell me a little bit more about those, what before COVID were perceived to be absolutely difficult, different and radical things to do, rather than difficult, apologies.
Yeah, well, I've always really enjoyed... Well, to be honest, I found working in an office quite stifling. The fact that you have to sit there from 9 to 5, whether you finished your work or not, is really irritating. And, I personally find I'm quite productive in the mornings and then 3, 4 o'clock onwards, but there's a big gap in the middle when I'm actually, I might as well just go for a walk, which is exactly what I do in my normal working day. And I thought, I can't be the only person who feels like that. And why do we all have to sit looking at each other all the time to work collaboratively anyway? And I was also fortunate when I was a student. I had a lovely experience there was a team of us students who worked for Architecture Sans Frontieres, and we did a project at the Eden Project, and we had a very similar model. So we met up once a week, had a big meeting, shared lots of ideas, and we all went away with a patch of work to get on with by ourselves. And it worked so well, and I thought, this is really good. Why doesn't this happen more often? So I got the opportunity to try it out for myself when I took on employees, which was an experiment in itself, but it worked really well. So, and now there's 7 of us.
Would you still describe what you do as radical? I mean, who described it as radical in the first place? Was that yourself?
No, it definitely wasn't me. And we're not all female anymore either. But it just started off that way. I think because my job adverts were quite inclusive in the way they were laid out. You know, I said there's lots of support, there's lots of flexibility. So it attracted lots of women. So I ended up taking on more women. I did interview some men, but yeah, and our first chat was Harry, and now we have James and we have Stephen as well.
So this idea that beforehand you had to balance being an architect and still having a life. I mean, that's something culturally within the profession that's hugely problematic, that there's a sense that you can't have both. That's a compromise in some way. What needs to be pulled apart there? Yeah,
well, when I studied interior architecture and then got the RIBA exam to carry on with architecture later, and I remember quite soon, I think my first week studying interior architecture, and I was quite interested in triathlon. I was doing lots of swimming and stuff, and I remember the course director saying, oh, a lot of people find they can't fit in sport. They try, but they can't. It's just, you know, it's all consuming, blah, blah. And I thought, I'm pretty sure I can still fit it in, and I'll just become more efficient somehow. And I did. I kept it up all the way through. So that was another kind of lesson, that you don't have to accept that architecture is all consuming. And I personally found the break that I took from cycling or whatever, I came back with really good ideas, and I put that into my work, and I was very good about having good working hours. I didn't work really late into the night. So that was really good learning and good practice for the future.
What is the difference, do you think, between the way that you're able to be efficient with your time and then this culture which suggests, no, you have to spend almost every waking hour, and maybe some that you're asleep, working on your projects and your designs?
I think it comes from a perfectionist thing and also the artist thing. You know, you're never finished with art, and there's no right and wrong answer like with maths or another science. So it can be tricky to say, yeah, I'm done now. I suppose I have a tendency not to just accept things as they are. If I want to do something else, I'll find a way of doing it. So it is partly a mindset thing. But yeah, I still don't really get it. And having said that, Oxford Brookes particularly have when I was teaching there, they stopped the 24-hour pass, because that was supposed to send a message out to people: you don't need to be here 24 hours, which I think that helps, that kind of message.
Now, your book suggests that there is a way that you can design your life so that you can, work well, have that balance. Explain a little bit more, especially in architecture, because I think there are probably quite a few people crying out for this kind of understanding. What do I need to do differently so that I can get this balance right?
Yeah, it is tricky, and I'm not at all saying I've got it all. I really hate that sentence that you can have it all, because you absolutely can't. It's all about compromise and priorities. And for me, there was no point having an architecture practice if it didn't give me a life outside of it. So that was my aim, and that was my priority. It wasn't winning design awards or doing international work or that kind of thing, which other people are motivated by. So that being said, I've really enjoyed the projects that I've worked on, and I feel like I've progressed, or the eco design specialism that we do, and I've really enjoyed writing books. So I think it is mostly about prioritization, and that goes down to your weekly schedule. If you start on a Monday morning and you're like, okay, these are the things I absolutely have to do, what are my other priorities? you're not getting led astray by emails and other distractions that come through, and then you can become really efficient and meet your goals. I'm not saying I do this every single week, but most of the time
that's the ideal.
Yeah.
But you run your own practice, and there are women who are in other practices and who don't have this kind of flexibility. What would you say to those practices to try to get the most out of, well, not just the women, the people really in their practices?
I think it's a great shame that a lot of women particularly, and men too, are leaving conventional practice just because they can't get flexible working. They're maybe not naturally business minded. They didn't really want to set up as freelance or something. They just want a flexible job. I see that quite a lot in a lot of the sole traders that I know. I think that's a shame that they have to take on that extra stress of running a business when they just wanted flexible working. And these really great minds are leaving practice, and it doesn't take that much to organise flexible working. A lot of people think it's a massive admin stress, but I don't find it to be a problem at all. It doesn't cause me any extra bother as an employer, and I certainly don't feel like I have to be watching my staff and checking that they're working all the time. I mean, it's just it's results driven. So if the work's not getting done, then and you can see. You don't need to be looking over their shoulder all the time. And anyway, we're all architects. We're all really passionate about doing the work that we're doing. It's quite easy to be self-motivated if you love what you do.
I think that's one of the issues, is that people are maybe coming out and trying to set up on their own. And it's leading to a very fragmented sector, really, and that ability to move forward together as a sector to make change in society might be compromised as a result of that.
Yeah, to be honest, I think if you're not offering flexible working in the coming years, then you're just going to be left behind. Younger students all want that. Whenever I give lectures, they're all really well attended, and people are going, yeah, this is what I want. I didn't know it existed. Great that it does. They want that kind of, some of them want that kind of nomad life. I mean, me and my staff have all worked abroad at various points in which is wonderful. It's really enriching, and it's enabled me to write books. It's enabled other people to do research and charity projects and all sorts of other things outside of their daily work. And how is architecture losing from that outside influence? It's not. It's gaining massively. So I think you're missing out if you're not part of the flexible working.
Well, Clare Nash, architect and founding director of Clare Nash Architects, has written Design Your Life, which is available here at the RIBA bookshop at a discount as well. If you go to ribabookshop.com/radio, RIBA-radio, you can pick it up. Coming up in the next hour, we're continuing to talk about the experience of women in architecture.
Take a chance and enter the RIBA Radio Lucky Prize Draw.
Oh yes, you have to take a chance. You have to. And enter our lucky prize draw. We have 2 fabulous prizes to give away. Win a 2-night stay for you and a friend or lover. You knew I was going to do it, didn't you? In one of Mallinson's gorgeous woodland tree houses. They are uniquely designed. These funky luxury retreats include fab things for a pampering stay like hot tubs, saunas, cargo nets, daybeds suspended above a stream beneath an oak canopy, and wood-burning stoves if it's chilly. The tree houses are a perfect place to escape to and get away from it all. That's one prize that you could win. Another prize you could win is to win tickets to see the Specials live. Their show next July in Dublin sold out ages ago, but we've managed to secure 2 tickets for our lucky winners, plus a night stay at a hotel of your choice in Dublin, up to the value of £200. I knew the team would get it. I knew it. Saturday, 2nd of July, 2022, Trinity College, Dublin is the date for the diary. So you need to enter the draw. How do you enter the draw? You go to the RIBA Radio webpage on architecture.com and just fill in the form. And you need a magic word. So I'm going to whisper it now. The magic word is giraffe. Giraffe. You need to pop that in, and then you'll be able to enter the prize draw. The winners will be announced live during the last RIBA radio broadcast on Friday, the 26th of November. Plus, each entry will receive a limited edition booklet that folds out in a unique way. Now I'm going to just reach across my desk right now. Oh, excuse me, whilst I do this in a very noisy and unprofessional fashion, to reach and get this A2 poster, which is gorgeous. It's all folded really uniquely. It's beautifully designed, and it's got 10 top tips for inclusion. I've got 10 top tips for inclusion. It's an absolute must for the office wall. Full terms and conditions, by the way, can be found on architecture.com for the competition. So it's not a competition, sorry, it's a prize draw. Can't say it's a competition. That's something completely different in architecture, isn't it? But it is really gorgeous. I really do recommend you enter it for the poster alone, which is really a wonderful piece of artwork, if nothing else. But coming up, we're still talking CQ knowledge. We're talking women with a fantastic panel, and later on we'll be talking about race. You are listening to RIBA Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects. With RIBA Radio, we're bringing you 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion into everything you do, and it's all rooted in the foundational behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence. You are listening to RIBA Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects, with me, Marsha Ramroop. I'm the Director of Inclusion here, and we're bringing you 28 hours of material. We've done 5, so there's 19 to go. Have I got that right? I can't. I hope to bring you inclusion into everything that you do, and everything we do is rooted in the behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence. Coming up this hour is the first of our 2 days talking CQ knowledge, which is the capability which asks us to examine what do we know, what are we thinking about, what do we need to know. We're looking at different lived experiences of the underrepresented in architecture. So we're talking women and we're talking race today, and we have a stellar lineup for you to listen to and to learn from. We've heard from Dr. Annabel Sowemimo, the Fawcett Society, and Clare Nash. Shortly, we're going to hear from architects Melody Leung from Zaha Hadid, Farshid Musavi, OBE, alongside Roma Agrowal Mbe, the engineer, talking about their experiences, ideas, and focus. After
Dish of the Day.
Hi, I'm Chris, the head chef at RIBA. My chosen dish for Dish of the Day is a warm chocolate fondant with vanilla ice cream. The reason I've chosen this is because it's chocolate and such a warm, cosy dessert with a touch of elegance, especially with it getting colder outside. I hope you enjoy.
Oh, amazing. Mouth-watering food is one of the key ways we can really connect with each other, especially those who are different from us. So I hope our daily dishes are giving you some ideas how you might do that more effectively. Now, we're going to have a deep dive into some of the issues that seem to systemically affect women in architecture and the built environment. And I want to really make clear at this stage, as we talk about CQ knowledge, at no point is there any expectation that those from underrepresented groups should be responsible for fixing the issues that discrimination has led them to. This and other discussions around lived experience about those who have the authority, who have the power to make change, listening and acting on those experiences that are very different to their own. And these discussions are part of that opportunity. And so to our extraordinary A-list of women, Roma Agrowal Mbe, which she describes as a mega badass engineer, is an award-winning engineer, author and broadcaster, from footbridges and sculptures to train stations and skyscrapers, including the Shard. She's left an indelible mark on London's landscape. And actually, whilst I work from London, I stay with my mum. I think I mentioned this before. And as I reach the crest of the hill of the street where she lives in this northwest London suburb, I can see the spire of St Mary's Church on Harrow on the Hill, and then tracking across the horizon, the Arch of Wembley and the skyscrapers of the city, and there's the Shard. And I have one half-decent picture of it as the sun's rising and the clouds are low, and a strong band of orange creating the perfect backdrop to a silhouette of the structures there. So I might tweet that later at Marsha Ramroop. We're also joined by Farshid Musavi OBE. She's an Iranian-born British architect, educator and author. She's founder of Farshid Musavi Architecture and a professor in practice of architecture at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. And to those in the architecture space, you know, you need little introduction. Prolific, successful, determined. She's added a great deal to the discussion about spaces. And Melody Leung joined Zaha Hadid Architects in 2005. In addition to designing products, furniture, interiors and architecture, she assisted Zaha in creating and designing the Zaha Hadid Gallery, where she also oversees the installation of new exhibitions. So thank you all very much indeed for joining me. If I can start with you, Roma, how would you describe yourself and what have you negotiated as a woman in the built environment? Even that isn't too big a question to start with.
So I describe myself, professionally speaking, as an engineer and author. Even being able to say the word author has taken me a lot of work because I still don't see myself as a professional writer now. In terms of, we're talking about diversity today, I'm an immigrant, I'm a woman, I'm a person of color. I do actually speak English as a first language, but I know that that's not the case for a lot of immigrants from around the world. And I often talk about the fact that I'm short because we're in the built environment, and when we're talking about designing spaces that feel inclusive to everyone, then being short actually does have an impact. I can't always reach those bars to keep myself stable on the bus or the tube, for example. So I don't know, those are a few bits of description. And your second question was about what I've negotiated.
Yeah, as a woman in the built environment.
So it's an interesting one, because with me we talk about intersectionality and you can't always tell why a particular situation came up with me. One of the biggest things I've actually had to negotiate is the fact that I didn't have an engineering degree. I had a degree in physics. So when I tried to first enter this industry, the professional institutions were saying to me that you don't have the right degree. You have a physics degree and you need to have an engineering degree in order to get membership. And that's just graduate membership I'm talking about of this professional institution. So when I think back to why I had a physics degree, I wonder sometimes whether, because I went to a girls' school for my A-levels. Before that, I was in India. I knew I wanted to do something sciencey, something technical. And it's possible that because I'm a woman, nobody ever suggested to me that engineering might be the right degree to do. So I ended up doing a pure science, which I thoroughly enjoy. I have no regrets about. But let's say that was a big barrier to me even entering the profession in the first place.
Melody, how would you describe yourself, and what would you say you've negotiated as a woman in architecture?
As a bit of background, I'm from Chicago originally. I'm Chinese American. So I think I grew up always straddling between the family that I went to visit in Hong Kong and this kind of intense diversity of cultures that came from this colonial city that was very adjacent to its Chinese heritage. And then I studied in New York at Columbia, and then I made my way over to London to work for Zaha. So I think I was always drawn to Europe because of its cosmopolitanism. Everyone is so connected to the background from which they're from. And I think I found that really fascinating. And even in the office, when I joined, in a way, I was a minority as a native English speaker. And that kind of vibrancy of different perspectives and different backgrounds was, on the one hand, also a big learning experience for me, I think, from a personal level in life. But then also, I think, over time, I reflect on how it influenced the way that we design and the kind of many different perspectives that we bring to any project when we collaborate. I think in terms of my journey in negotiating, in some ways, I was also very fortunate because it was maybe only midway through my career that it really became a topic. It became something that I would notice in terms of my background as a female practitioner. It was the place where I had a lot of support, I think. I had a lot of sponsorship from Zaha and from my colleagues. So I didn't really notice it through my studies and through the early years in the office. And then it's only through getting to certain points where taking on bigger responsibilities on behalf of projects or negotiating maybe the larger responsibilities within the leadership of the office, that it's still an ongoing journey, I would say.
Interesting. Farshid, how would you describe yourself, and what would you say you've negotiated as a woman in architecture?
It's difficult to it's actually difficult for me to describe it as a negotiation, as a product of me being a woman, because I don't really know what it's like to be a man. I think everyone negotiates different things in their lifetime, and I don't want to give the kind of idea that women have difficulties and men don't. I think in my particular case, what probably is distinctive is that, I was a refugee as 14 years old. So were my parents, and they had to start life all over again from scratch at a very young, relatively young age. They were in their early, 30s and with 3 children. So probably growing up with that kind of start in the UK has been somewhat a unique factor in my upbringing, which I'm sure a lot of other migrants, who find themselves in that situation have also experienced and are experiencing. But I think that's much more of a significant factor than me being a woman, I would say.
Interesting. And Roma, how would you respond to the idea that women maybe have some issues that men don't, or vice versa? You yourself have had quite a journey.
I think there are differences in people's experiences, but I agree with Farshid that those experiences can come from a lot of different perspectives. It can be gender, it can be health, it can be language, it can be socioeconomic background. There are so many different things that make people different, and each of those has their own challenges and so on. But that's why I think I mentioned intersectionality very early on, because it's not always clear which of the issues I have come up against, I suppose. But for me, that suggestion about doing engineering feels like a gendered barrier, because I'm pretty sure that if some boy was studying further maths, physics, and design and technology at A level, I'm pretty sure somebody would have suggested to him, those are the perfect engineering A levels, apply for engineering. That seems like a no-brainer. But I completely agree that all of us have different experiences and so on. I guess one of the experiences that I've had as a cis-het woman is the fact that I was struggling with infertility. I had to have IVF treatments, and then I had a very, very anxious and sometimes quite ill pregnancy that followed. And that was a very eye-opening experience for me, in the sense that I suddenly realized that as equal as me and my husband could be in bringing up this future child, when it came to conceiving and carrying that child, I had a huge burden to carry in comparison to him.
I mean, Fawcett, you've spoken about, you know, trying to inspire your daughter or to get her into the profession or not, as the case may be. How has having children impacted on your actual, you know, ability to practice architecture, or has it not?
I think on the one hand, it has grounded me, very often. I mean, I don't mean in a bad way, meaning it's given me some, some distance to my work, just like, we know that having children means a fair amount of distraction, which I found a healthy kind of distraction, because I would be otherwise working just all the time, nonstop. So I'm very happy about having had a child. It is an extra massive project. I've also found myself as a single mother as of when she was around 11. So it's been extra challenging. But I don't think that has to do with me being an architect. I mean, I think women do find themselves with taking most of the times a bigger share of a child's upbringing when they are very little, just because of what the mother does and what the father does in those early days. But I think, given a healthy relationship, parents of a child should be able to manage it the way I think parents with other professions do. So I'm not really sure if this is architecturally specific. It is a life situation that I think we all need to kind of face at some point. But I haven't found it any more difficult than other people. In fact, I think for architects, it can be easier, because there is an informality to an architecture office, or at least of the size that I represent, that perhaps doesn't exist if you are practicing medicine or law or professions like that. So I found that when my daughter was very little, she was coming to the office after school, and everyone just loved having her around, and I was very happy to have her around. And I know that if people in my office are in that situation, they have, on occasions brought their children around after school, or if they need to run and pick up a child from school. I think these are things that with architecture we can easily manage. So I hope that architects do consider having children if they want to, and that their jobs don't deter them from it.
We're speaking to Melody Leung from Zaha Hadid, Farshid Musavi alongside Roma Agrowal Mbe, the engineer, about being women in the built environment. Coming up later, we have science journalist and author of Superior, The Return of Race Science, Angela Saini, speaking about race. If you missed it earlier, we had on the Fawcett Society speaking about the gender pay gap and equal pay. And you can catch up with that as we repeat all of our content as live after our live broadcast is over today. We're speaking to Melody Leung from Zaha Hadid, Farshid Musavi, OBE, alongside Roma Agrowal Mbe, the engineer, talking about being women in the built environment. And Melody, you're picking up on Roma's point about intersectionality and the fact that the intersectionality for you, if you don't know, is about those different layers that can cause disadvantage depending on your particular characteristics. And Melody, you described you have various different identifiers, if you like. Which one do you think, you said as you moved up the ladder in your career, they seem to be playing out in different ways now? What did you mean by that?
I mean, I have to preface with, I think I'm also incredibly privileged. Like Farshid and Roma alluded to, it's not always just gender that sometimes influence the way that people perceive us. It's also many other aspects of our backgrounds, our networks, the things that we have access to from a young age. And I think, so in the bigger picture, I'm actually extremely privileged to be able to have the education that I have and the network of support that I had growing up, as well as now in my career. And I think what happened maybe over time is I was in some ways very, very fortunate to always have the sponsorship of my professors or of Zaha when I was in the office. And I didn't really think too much at that time I didn't really doubt or I didn't really question entering new situations. And we worked on a lot of projects where oftentimes we came in as young designers working on projects that we had never worked on before. But we brought a lot of creativity, I think. We had a lot to bring to the table and we didn't really question it. And that was something that we were really lucky to have at that time. And I think then over time, when the responsibility becomes bigger, for example, I'm responsible for a bigger team of very many different people from different backgrounds. You know, we have to look at who we're hiring to bolster the team. Then I think I'm also speaking on behalf of many more people, and that becomes something that I always have to question because we're only the product of all of our lived experience. And there's a lot that I have to kind of put myself in other people's shoes, or sometimes also be a little bit more, like have a louder voice in a sense to be able to represent them properly at the table.
Interesting. Thank you for that insight. And actually, your speaking there reminds me, funnily enough, of Dale Carnegie, who wrote How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's written in 1936, of course, and so his frame of reference is Al Capone. And he says the only reason Al Capone was the way that he was because he had the experiences that he did and that he grew up surrounded by the things that he did, and he could only be the way that he was because he was. And that's the same for all of us, that we could only be the way that we are. The only reason we're not a rattlesnake is because our parents weren't rattlesnakes. And that's the point that he's making, that those who come to us sort of bigoted and unyielding are that way because of who they are. And so we have to try to understand that and be sympathetic towards it. Roma, you have chosen to somewhat leave behind a bit of a career and focus on your writing, but was that a choice, or did you feel that was thrust upon you?
I mean, it's been quite a roller coaster the last few years, I'd say. So going into my profession as an engineer, as a young engineer in my 20s, that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to be an engineer, design projects, you know, get promoted to a point where I was perhaps managing those projects. And yes, I achieved that to an extent. In the meantime, I had the good fortune of working on the Shard, good fortune in the sense that it's a very iconic, well-known project. And I learned a huge amount as, you know, a young engineer about structural engineering. I got to work with amazing architects, meet brilliant people, and so on. And because I looked very different than the other engineers in my team, you know, engineering is a far less diverse profession than architecture. I think the numbers are it's between 10 and 12% of engineers are women, and about 3 to 4% of engineers are people of color. I believe that number might be slightly out of date. It's not a diverse place, and I looked and sounded very different, and I was also the youngest person on my team. So I would go out, so as with my colleagues, we would speak about our work on the Shard, we would speak to engineers, we would speak to other, you know, engineers, other professionals in the built environment. But because of who I am and what I look like, I started getting invitations from schools, from universities, and people started calling me a role model. They wanted to write articles about me and interview me. And I was a bit like, whoa, you know, what's going on? This is not anything that I've planned. But it suddenly started dawning on me a few years into my career that, hold on a second, I actually have a voice and I can do something about this lack of diversity in my profession. And at that point, I sort of took it upon myself, as have so many others like me, to try and inspire young people. And the Shard was an amazing starting point and tool in order for me to do that. the writing career feels like it was thrust on me because I actually do not like writing. I hate it less than I used to, but it's not my natural state of being. What I found challenging was, as my career progressed, I was basically managing two parallel careers. One was my technical construction career, and then secondly was this sort of media career. And they sort of worked in parallel for a while, but there came a point in the last couple of years where I had a child, I went on maternity leave, then there was a pandemic, then there were redundancies in my firm. And I just said, you know what, I'm currently writing another book. One, I just focus on that and see how things go. So I decided to take voluntary redundancy. And over a year on, I'm really busy with lots of other sorts of projects. So never say never. I love my industry. I want to go back into it. It has major problems, and we can talk about more of that later. But at this point in time, I am focusing on the writing and advocacy work.
Farshid, the Women in Architecture group recently did a survey and, had various results and call to action. One of the questions they asked was about women wanting to remain in the profession. And, there's a strong consensus. 74% want to remain in their profession and they feel that they're supported. However, the women who wish to stay aren't free from concerns, whether it's ranging from finances or that balance work-life or sector-wide problems. Is there something that you could say to, you talked about your own practice being very open and people being able to come in with their families and so on. Is there something that you think other firms could maybe learn from the way that you do things that mean that it could feel a little bit more open to them, and that 25% who maybe feel that they're not ready or feel that they may need to leave the profession could learn from?
Well, first of all, I'm happy to hear those numbers. I thought they were more gloomy. I'm really happy to hear that, because the usual, let's say, word is that, it's like almost 50-50 until we finish architectural university, and then the numbers radically drop. So I'm very happy to hear that. I can only speak from a smaller practice, because I think size has a lot to do, it seems to have a lot to do with it. The larger practices that become, the more structure there is, there needs to be in place. And so you do lose, I think, the informality and some of the flexibility, let's say, that the smaller practice can have. I personally spend a huge amount of time interviewing every single person that comes to the office. There is no one who comes to my office who is not, who doesn't get interviewed by me. So I place a lot of importance on the team spirit that there is in the office, and that the characters gel. On the one hand, an office needs different strengths, and with that comes different personalities. We are in that sense very diverse. But on the other hand, the team needs to it takes just one or two people who don't get on with other people in a smaller office for the whole thing to be very uncomfortable rather than pleasurable. And so I think that has to do, that's one of the things I do to try to make it a good environment to be in. We are intentionally not trying to be a huge office. Obviously, at times we will be larger than other times because of the workload that we have. But I do think the agility and the flexibility that you have as a small to medium office is something that you lose when you're much larger. And so maybe, we should really be reflecting on what do we gain and what do we lose by being large.
It's something certainly, I think, as we talk about the voice of architecture in the profession, whether the voice of the smaller and medium firms are as significant as the larger firms, and what that actually means for the profession going forward. Melody, earlier we had Clare Nash, who's written Design Your Life, which talks about balancing work and life. But one of the things that's said is that 10 years ago, Clare was struggling with a common problem, how to be an architect and still have a life. Would you, Melody, have any views on whether architecture is your life if you go into the profession, or there is a? It seems culturally that there's something problematic inherently in that, but is there a different viewpoint to that?
I mean, I always tell students when I give talks and when I meet them to make the most of every learning experience that they have around them. And that means also just being aware of the spaces that they're moving through, the cities that they live in. I think as an architect, in a way, it's inescapable from the way that we see the world and in our day-to-day lives. In terms of a kind of balance and the hours that we work on projects or invest in further education or build up relationships, which also become invaluable in our careers. I think it's down to each individual. It takes a lot of discipline. That's probably something that is then, it's a very personal decision, I think, in terms of how people decide to approach each day, approach their kind of 5-year, 10-year plans looking forward. And that changes very much from practice to practice, from communities of like professional networks that people are plugged into. So there's many, many different ways to go about becoming an architect and to integrate one's kind of personal viewpoints on how they value their time and how they balance it out. So I don't know, I mean, I'm kind of saying for me, it's inseparable. I think as an architect, when we're shaping the spaces for how people and how families and communities live, we have to bring to it, again, our lived experiences. And we also have to be able to delineate where, what are the priorities, where's the most valuable places for us to invest our time.
We're speaking to architects Melody Leung from Zaha Hadid, Farshid Musavi OB, alongside Roma Agrowal Mbe, the engineer, about being women in the built environment. And we'll have more from them shortly. Coming up in the next half of the show, we're talking race. What is it? How do we navigate it? What's the impact of it for those from racialised groups? A must listen. Earlier, we spoke to Dr. Annabel Sowemimo about reproductive health and the impact of the traditional working environment on women and those with female reproductive realities, and the obvious fallacy that women are not just differently shaped men, but that how that is played out in work settings. And you can catch up with that later on this listen link, which I understand we've got about 100 people at least listening, and we've had about 3,000 listens over the last few days. So that's amazing. If you want to share even more widely, I mean, I personally be very grateful, but I think hopefully those who are able to dial in and listen will get a lot from it too. Right now we're speaking to architects Melody Leung from Zaha Hadid and Farshid Musavi OBE alongside Roma Agrowal Mbe, the engineer, about being women in the built environment. And if I can come to you, Roma, to speak a little bit more about your experience. You know, things you've had to balance quite a lot. You're saying quite a lot has happened in the last 5 to 7 years. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so we mentioned briefly before about the fact that I'm sort of outside the industry at the moment, and in some ways I'm the stereotype, right? I'm 38, I have a very young child, and I kind of fell out of the industry, and that is the typical sort of age when women tend to fall out of the industry. For me, it was mostly by choice, obviously not helped by a pandemic. Various things that I've been, I guess, trying to get my head around over the last few years. So I would say that early in my career, I was incredibly well encouraged, supported. My media career that I started to kind of grow in parallel to my technical career was lauded, and I was given time to go off and do what I wanted, as long as, I was being respectful to my employers and so on. But I feel that at some point, when my success my success felt unpalatable to the powers that be, essentially. And at some point I could see a big flip where I had been amazingly well supported, and suddenly my opportunities with the media and with doing interviews or writing stuff were actively being taken away from me. And I could feel that discomfort, but I've only been able to start to articulate what it was that happened fairly recently. And so eventually I decided to change employers, but I did work for somebody who essentially didn't speak to me for about 6 months. And it was just for very, kind of work related things that a few words would be exchanged. So I ended up in quite an uncomfortable environment. So I moved on, and I moved on to some really wonderful, very supportive companies. So it's been quite a mixed bag in that sense. And then to top all of that off, my personal life got very complicated when, basically I tried to have a child and underwent 3 rounds of IVF. My then employer was incredibly supportive of that, but, talking about, making workspaces more flexible for anybody, I had to go inject myself. I had to take medication. I had to go for tons of appointments and scans, and I required that flexibility around that. When I did get pregnant, well, then, I had failed rounds, and then that had an impact on my mental health. I then got pregnant, and I was, too much information, but I was being sick between 8 and 10 times a day, and basically having to run from meetings in my office, from meeting rooms into the toilets. And I was incredibly tired. My blood sugar was all over the place. And again, I was just given, this was my first trimester. So I had told people in my office, look, I'm early pregnant. People normally don't share that information. And then I was again given the flexibility to work from home. I was having naps most days when I was working from home, because I simply couldn't stay awake for the full working day. And again, I just was able to kind of move my hours around. So yeah, so a lot has gone on. And it's stuff that I'm still, to be honest, working through. I was diagnosed with postnatal depression. I'm on medication for that. I'm trying to reconcile a lot of stuff that happens through my career, and really trying to figure out what I'm going to do with my career going forward. So if you ask me what I'm doing next year, the answer is I don't know, because my book will be finished around March, hopefully. and then, yeah, I'm kind of open to see what comes next.
Well, thank you for your honesty and sharing that, Roma. Farsha, just to go back to a couple of the earlier points that Roma was making there, it may or may not be because she was a woman, it may or may not be because she is a woman of colour, but that issue of maybe jealousy, envy, how much do you have to navigate that in architecture as a successful woman yourself?
It's a difficult one. I think I'm lucky that in the end, I come across people who don't have that problem with me. So I think one's life can also be, I think we can also be blind by what we don't see. But I tell you what, I am aware of the fact that when people do get very successful, and this is not just women, I do know of male architects who attract a lot of jealousy because they are very successful. And this, again, I think we should separate gender issues from, just general issues. And it is a funny one, because when you are starting out, there is a lot of, I think, goodwill towards you, because people want to encourage, young startups, etc. Then when you do something good, they want to celebrate you. And I've kind of experienced that definitely. And then probably most people are in some kind of mid thing where, they are not super successful to attract that kind of probably envy and jealousy, and they don't belong to that. Now, in my own particular case, because I had to start again, 11 years ago, my practice kind of dissolved and I had to start again. So in a way, I out of something that was personally for me, a kind of a terrible situation, something good came across, which meant that I was a startup again. So at the time when, if things had kept on going as they were, maybe I would have been maybe more and more successful. I had to restart again, and so I found myself in this in between situation where basically people don't think of mid-career people. It's mostly either when you're really young and they want to support you, or when you're really successful, and then you either attract people or you attract jealousy. I would say the envy and jealousy factor is there. I do know it's also towards men, and I'm not saying that women don't encounter it. For sure they do, but I do think men do too.
Melody, do you have a view on whether women might get that kind of reaction more than men? What's your experience?
I don't think, I know that there's some conversation in certain circles, let's say, that people will say, oh, she's being treated that way, or she's being perceived in a negative way because she's female, would they treat a man like that? I also, like Farshid, personally prefer to kind of stay away from those types of classifications, because I find it reductive to bring it back just to someone's gender. It's important to look at the full picture, and like you were mentioning before, this is a whole myriad of intersectionality. It's really much more about opening up all the different ways in which we can be more inclusive in the industry, and offering chances for people who communicate differently, or people who bring very different skill sets to the table. I think one thing while Farshid was speaking that crossed my mind is also, what does success look like? Because I think for some people, it's not necessarily the exposure in the media, the big projects, the kind of press, or even maybe even recognition in academic circles. I think for some people, success can be much more, maybe less visible, or it can be more about influence in ways that are a little bit less explicit. So I think to be really clear about that, as an individual, I was going to say, one of the things that I would advise for young architects, or even something that I'm going through myself, is finding those ways to find your voice and your own priorities, because otherwise we can get really washed away by what we're being fed in the media, what the kind of overarching narrative, which is sometimes much louder or more visible, easier to process. I guess I also had a question for both Roma and Farshid along those lines, which is if you had any advice for how you maybe, I know you're going through the process, Roma, right now, but in terms of finding your voice as an architect, or also Farshid as a professor, because I know, even though you have a small practice, you're very, very influential, and I really, really respect the series of research that you've done with your books and your studios at Harvard. So I guess I'm kind of curious what kind of advice you have to share with those people who are listening.
Go.
Shall I go first?
Yeah, do.
I think there is another way to, whilst we should champion, equal treatment of everyone at the workplace. We should champion diversity. I think we should also champion the idea that being a minority is a good thing. I think with being a minority, and minority can be, you know, minority gender, can be minority of race, it could be of your height, it could be anything. I think it gives you a different perspective, which I think in a creative situation is quite powerful, because you see things in a different way. And with design, you know, comes the need to think differently, so that we you know, so that we act more creatively, we make spaces that are inspiring. You know, more of the same is not inspiring. More of the same, and the idea of consensus means being, I think, banal, and people taking their surroundings for granted, and not being inspired. So, you know, I think I would encourage everyone to always step outside the normatives and try to be an outsider, even if they are born as part of the majority. So I think if we think this way, then we stop being worried about being outsiders in whichever way, and we use that to our strengths. We use that as a way to be creative. And, you know, despite the fact that, yes, I was born in Iran, I am a woman, yes, I'm short, all these things. When I'm working, I don't think of myself as less able. I think of myself as having the strengths to deal with any design problem. Obviously, in more of a real life situation, yes, when I have to, you know, lift up my luggage to put it on the thing above my head in a plane, I feel disadvantaged, but not necessarily as a woman, but as a human being. Yes, we can design, and we should encourage all our spaces to be better designed so that they don't disadvantage people. I'm afraid in the end, when it comes to the plane thing, somebody is going to be disadvantaged. I don't know how we are going to make everybody happy, but I think we should keep questioning those things. But at the same time, I think we should also encourage people to be themselves, and to make people feel comfortable to be themselves, and to feel strong for what they are. I feel quite strong about that.
Roma?
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear about that strength, and I think the people that work with you, Farshid, they're very lucky to have that, because my experience, and it could be that the gender balance in engineering is just so much more stark, is that I couldn't separate being a woman from my situation. So while I consider myself 100% as capable as anybody else, I was consistently in meetings where I was the only woman, and I would be interrupted, I would be talked over, I would be asked to get the coffee, to take the notes, all those kind of typical things you hear. I've been to meetings where I was surrounded by pictures of naked women, and I have to have a conversation about that. So I can't separate my gender there either. The thing I think that hurt the most was when I was becoming more successful and well known, and people started saying, oh, it's only because she's a woman and an ethnic minority that she's ticking these boxes, and that's why she's getting these opportunities, and us white men are not getting these opportunities. And that was very deeply painful to me, because actually the amount of barriers I have faced because of who I am, you know, would suggest that I have had to fight a lot for stuff that these men didn't, and I did, and now they're kind of turning that back on me. The other thing I find quite frustrating is people talk a lot in my industry about, oh, that woman, she's been so over-promoted, and she doesn't have the capabilities to do this job. She's quite an average engineer. And I feel like men are allowed to be average, but as women, we have to really kind of be extraordinary to be taken seriously. So in my kind of situation, I have found that, yes, there are a lot of advantages. People remember who I am. I've been able to stand out. I've got opportunities that nobody else got. Absolutely. But what people don't see in the background are these really kind of awful behaviors that slowly chip away at you. And coming into 15 years in my career, I am now quite worn out.
Architects Melody Lung from Zaha Hadid, Farshid Musabi OBE and Roma Agrowal Mbe. Very powerful. You are listening to RIBA Radio. What an extraordinary hour from some amazing women talking about their experiences as women in the built environment. Absolutely amazing to hear from them. We're bringing you 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion into everything you do. It's all rooted in that foundational behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence. It is CQ Knowledge Day. We've been talking women, and now we're going on to look at race.
RIBA Radio with Marsha Ramroop.
You are listening to RIBA Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects, with me, Marsha Ramroop. I'm the Director of Inclusion here, and it's happened again. I've just run back from the toilet. I was absolutely bursting the last hour, but I couldn't possibly go because what an amazing, amazing panel that we just had talking about women. Roma's personal story, just so powerful. If you've missed it, you haven't missed it. You can run back and listen again after our live broadcast today. We are on day 3 of bringing you 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion into everything you do, rooted in CQ, cultural intelligence. And coming up this hour is the first of our 2 days talking about CQ knowledge, which is the capability which asks us to examine what do we know, what are we thinking about, what do we need to know. We're looking at different lived experiences of the underrepresented in architecture. We've already been talking women, and now we're talking specifically about race. Shortly, we'll hear from the author and science journalist Angela Saini.
Hi everyone, my name is Paola and I'm playing my soundtrack on RIBA Radio today.
And we look forward to hearing from her. And I'm going to keep it real. I always do. Be really honest with you, bearing my soul here. And being able to work on this radio station has been a real treat, not only because I get to share my expertise with you, which has felt a little bit self-indulgent, and some may even feel that, you know, it's a bit like that, but I've had real enthusiasm for this project from some of the best architects and best thinkers about discrimination and inclusion, at least in the very UK, and in some cases we're getting global leaders in their field. And I'm getting such a sense from all of these contributors that we really hope that we can make a difference with this radio station in helping you to move forward, to be inspired, to understand how you can take action.
You've been listening to RIBA Radio. Real, inclusive, brilliant action.